Lou. And Joel is our new co-chair, and he's on Meet.co right now listening. Thank you. Welcome, Joel, verbally this time. The new Noel, as you've seen this all before, it is any contribution, excuse me. Oh, I'm on the wrong. Sorry, I got the slides. Thank you. Anything you say here is considered an IETF contribution. There's, of course, we're using audio and Meet.co. It is being recorded. The video will be posted on YouTube afterwards. Blue sheets are being passed around or will be shortly. Please take time to sign them. There's, you're one of them, right? Okay. Can we ask for one more person to join the Etherpad? Oh, I'm the other one. Yeah. Can we ask one for someone else to, or please, can someone join the Etherpad to help us take notes? Any volunteers for Etherpad note taking? All right. Thank you, Eric. The online agenda, the agenda has been posted online, and of course, it's also on data tracker and tools page as well. And when you, if you do approach the micro, you want to say something, be sure to come to the microphones to speak. The individuals that are on Meet.co cannot hear the comments unless they're spoken clearly into the microphones. And also be sure to state your name at the beginning of your comment. Again, this is session 2. So the chairs will spend 10 minutes. We're halfway through it probably. Setting it up, doing a session intro, or into, apparently. And then we'll have a presentation from Martin on how we're resolving the last call comments for the schema mount draft. And then presentations from both Lada and Martin on 2 proposals for long-term solutions. And there will be time at the end for open discussion. Would anybody else like to propose something for the agenda?
We said yesterday that if we somehow ended up with extra time, that we would bring in Alex's presentation if he's still here.
I didn't see them.
All right, so we'll see what happens at the end, and we'll play that one by ear.
Yeah. Okay, so quickly from a process perspective, the publication of the schema mount drafts is moving forward. I think everyone saw Benoit's email posted to the Netmod mailing list. Was it yesterday? There is a new proposal for how to address the last call comments. As you've probably seen, there was some discussion around the 08 draft and how to progress it. On, what was it, the welcome reception Sunday night, a number of motivated individuals decided to see if we can do something better, and a last-minute scramble essentially resulted in updated drafts, not just the schema mount draft, but also all the dependent drafts, which were in RFC editor queue. Fortunately, all those dependencies and blockages have been resolved. And in fact, those drafts are, as I understand, are staying in RFC editor queue.
Right, because the only changes were in examples.
Mm-hmm. So that's moving on quickly. So there was a 09 draft that was posted, I think, was it Tuesday night? And that draft will go through another last call, a working group last call, so that everyone has an opportunity to discuss it on list. We hope that everyone will be satisfied with the current draft and it'll go quickly. And then for the long-term solution, we're, of course, in this session, we're initiating that discussion and the preferred approach for how to move forward with the long-term. Anything else you want to add to that? Okay.
But if there's questions, we're happy to entertain questions on process now. Martin's going to go through what the changes are. That should be a technical conversation. So now's the opportunity if you want to have any process discussion. we're hoping there's none, but we're open to it if anyone has any questions or wants to make any comments. And we have our AD here, and we're ready to talk if there's anything. So we have our plan.
Okay, good. I mean, maybe the last point I could make is, of course, we're going to the 2-week last call, but we also hope to expedite the Shepherd write-up and getting it to the RFC editor as quickly as possible. And so that way these drafts that have been waiting in the misref state can be published as quickly as possible. Okay. And with that, the first presenter is Martin.
Sorry, Martin. Is that the right one?
Yep, this is the right one. Okay, so this is, as Ken said, the presentation of the draft that was posted earlier this week. It's the 09 draft. So the changes from the previous version that was in working with last call is that essentially we removed the top-level schema structure that came from the old Yang library version, and instead say that every time you have a schema, it's going to be available under the mount point. So the details are that we removed the schema subtree, we removed the use schema method. So we had inline and use schema before. Inline works as it did in 08. Yeah. Okay. Better? Better? Okay, I'm going to speak close to the mic. So the use schema method is removed, and rather it's replaced with a new method called shared schema that has the same semantics as use schema used to have. But instead of having a reference up to the top level schema tree, the schema is available inline or under the mount point, but it has to be the same for all instances of this mount point. So in both the inline and shared schema case, the Yang library is instantiated under the mount point. In the shared schema case, the same instance is available under each, the same instance of Yang library is available under each mount point instance. And the parent reference that we used to have in uSchema, it works just like it did in uSchema for the new shared schema case. So this is a picture of the new tree. We have the prefix to namespace mapping as before, the global mount point list as before. The last case down here is the shared schema case, which just has a container shared schema and then the parent references. So this tree is very similar to one in 08, except that the top level schema is removed. Okay, so one important point here is that this document now allows any version of the Yang library to be instantiated under the mount point. So if you have a pre-NMDA server, you're allowed to use the old Yang library, of course, for your top-level stuff, but also for what's mounted under any mount point. Whereas an NMDA server can use the new Yang library. Okay, small point, but the inline and shared schema cases are presence containers rather than empty leaves, and this is to have some future enhancements possible. We make that possible to have future enhancements. And another important point that also Lou mentioned is that the LNE and NI documents, they do not have to change significantly. We changed the term, as I said, use schema is now called share schema, and then they have to update the examples, but that is basically it. I think that's the last slide.
Martin, are you taking questions now?
Sure.
Okay, Kent as a contributor. With the shared schema being a presence container, is that necessary when it has a leaf underneath it? It's a non-mandatory leaf, so it seems
Yeah,
like
exactly.
it already has the semantics of that you're looking for.
No, because the leaf, it's actually a leaf list, and it's not mandatory, so you don't have to have any parent references. So if shared schema was just a container, you couldn't create it unless you also created a parent reference, and we don't want to do that.
Okay.
Or we don't want to require that.
There's also the inline point you brought up privately. I don't know if you like that, if you want to make that.
The inline point, where it's a container instead of just empty leaves. Yeah, so now we have, in the shared schema case, we have the parent reference. Maybe it turns out that parent reference might be a good thing also in the inline case. So by having the containers, we ensure that we could add that in the future without breaking the module. Or anything else.
And not just other containers, but containers inside a choice. So new choice or new things can be added later on.
New things can be added. I mean, new cases can be added, and new stuff underneath those containers can be added.
Okay.
So any other questions about this solution? Crystal clear.
Was this your last slide?
This was my last slide, I think so, yeah. Now this is Ladas, so.
That must mean it's time for Lana to speak.
Well, let's make sure that we actually, okay.
Benoit, one quick question. So, in terms of next steps, I've seen some edits from Kent, right, in the mailing list, I believe. So you're going to post a new version of the document, write up. No. A new version, then 2 weeks last call, then the write-up. That's it?
Yes.
Okay.
So start working with last call.
Well, there'll need to be a 010, maybe?
No.
Or I guess take a
No,
look.
it's not.
Oh, my comments can already be out of this last call. Comments, right? On 09, even though we
No,
haven't started this.
we
last call
can
yet.
do we'll open the last call. It'll be done today by one of the chairs. There'll be 2 weeks to do a full review and any normal comments that can come up. Certainly your comment could be considered a last call comment, and we can discuss it more on list. There'll be another version if last call demands another version. If last call doesn't demand another version, we'll go forward with 09. It's really based on the comments that are received.
Sounds good.
Okay, so you want to move right into-
There is a question from the floor, from Jabber. The first one is, we are projecting, all this material is already uploaded, and what is being projected is the same as data tracker, but go to session 2, not session 1. And then Joel asked the question, is the approach described in section 6 sufficient to implement the NMDA and non-NMDA case? Is 09, the document 09, sufficient to cover NMDA and non-NMDA?
I think so, but again, people need to review and make sure that it's actually the case.
Yeah. So I think
But
I'm willing to
we
bet.
try to cover that in the document, yes.
Okay. So Joel, if it's not sufficiently clear, send a comment on this. We'll try to, the authors will try to make it more so. One of the things we didn't say before, because I think we're all just so in the mix of it, we may have forgotten to say it on the mic or in the session, is why we are having the second part of the discussion. The reason why we're having a second part of the discussion is the current solution is viewed as what was sufficient to meet current needs and just as importantly, be published now and allow us time to figure out what is the best way to support Yang Library BIS and NNMDA. The solution that we're talking about here was talked about before the sort of breakthrough that happened in NetConf in December. And so we're trying to do something that was discussed in the first Netmod session, which is moving to a point where we can publish something that maybe isn't perfect and then immediately start working on the next version. And by having something published, it gives us room, it gives us time to work on the next version, which we think will be a better long-term solution. So I don't know if Joel, if that's where you're getting. I see Joel says, okay, thanks. Of course, I wasn't looking at when he typed that, so I'm not sure if he's saying it to my explanation or something earlier.
Benoit, again. So for most of the Yang modules lately, we clearly wrote somewhere in the intro, this is NMDA compliant, right? So based on your answer, that's what we want to say. And I was just checking that it's both FIPO, NMDA and non-NMDA. But that's a kind of a key statement, right? Because it's exactly what we've been writing in 67 bis, that we must be NMDA compliant. It's not the best solution, we know that, we've discussed it, but it's a key message.
So you think we should add something more than we have?
The same type of text that we've been having, like with the latest Yang modules, that we are NMDA compliant.
I think you added that, didn't you?
Well, section 6 has it, but what Benoit is saying is that 6087 biz says that the introduction needs to have a statement in it as well. It would be caught by the Shepherd write-up. Or in the Shepherd review, that's a kind
Yeah,
of.
so I just want to,
Sorry, I will drop you an email. Don't worry.
right. I just want to show that it's clear that it also works for non-NMDA systems, so that if you put this in the introduction, it needs to be clear that pre-NMDA systems would also work. So people don't think that NMDA is a requirement for this.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'd like to present quite a concrete proposal for the future, but to start with, I'd like to present some kind of general objective that I hope we can all agree upon. It is basically what the pre-09 revision of the schema mount draft contained, that then became point of contention during the last few weeks. So the idea basically is to do what the use schema mechanism of schema mount did in the 08 revision, but to do it in a way that's integrated with the Yang library BIS, so that it's then much more compact and hopefully easier to understand. So the idea basically is to have some possibility in Yang library, an optional possibility, I must say, so it's not necessary that everybody uses it, so that we want to augment Yang library, I mean the Yang library BIS, the new version, NMDA compatible, and so that we can then embed a schema anywhere in the parent tree, which is what we were trying to do in the use schema approach of schema mount that has been abandoned in the version that Martin just presented. So I hope that Martin's proposal later on will basically be along these lines as well. So I'd like to ask if there are any objections to this objective. If not, so let me now present my proposed solution, which is actually also quite similar to the use schema mechanism, but this time it's completely independent on what's described in the new schema mount draft. So this will be just an independent mechanism that basically can be used along with or just either or with schema mount as necessary. Many aspects of my solutions are intentionally similar to Yang augments. I believe that this is quite important and useful in that it helps to understand the concept. So if somebody already knows how augments work in Yang, it shouldn't be very difficult to understand how this embedded schema mechanism works. And for tool makers, it's also important that tools can reuse most of the functions that must already be there in order to support augments. I checked my code, so this would be very easy extension actually. So it will be much harder, in fact, to implement the new Yang library, which I also plan to do. But this addition, this augment of the new Yang library will be, its implementation would be rather trivial. So in particular, what it means for this embedded schema, which can be also called external augment, perhaps. So what it means in particular, it means that, as you will see, the target node of the parent schema, which means it's the root node under which the embedded schema resides, is in this case identified using a schema node identifier that's included along with the specification of the embedded schema. I will show some examples later. This also means that no Yang extension like the mount point in schema mount is needed. It really works like an augment in the same way as augment that also uses schema node identifier. So it's the same here. And another advantage over perhaps the schema mount solution presented earlier is that the overall schema can be described in a compact form. So we needn't care about any data stores like operation where the schema mount, the embedded Yang library is supposed to be found. So it's really, it can be also saved in a file. So this might really help in the case that Balázs presented yesterday about Yang instance data. So this is, in my view, much more suitable for this purpose. We can also publish such augmented Yang library data in an RFC in order to describe a more complex data model and for similar purposes. So I tried to work out two examples. One of them, sorry, this is just, this shows what the augment that I'm talking about really means. So you can see it here on the ASCII tree. Basically, what's in boldface is the augment, and the rest is just the normal Yang library BIS schema. And I am only showing the part that's really augmented, and this is the schema container in Yang library BIS. So as you can see, apart from the stuff that was already there, it's the name of the schema and a reference to a module set for that schema. There is a new container called embedded schemas, and again, you can see that it's quite similar to what we had in schema mount before. So first of all, we can define some prefix to namespace mappings that we need, that we will need for specifying the target using the schema node identifier, but also for specifying the parent reference and the when condition if necessary. These are both, of course, optional. The target leaf is mandatory. So what this means is that apart from the previous solution from schema mount, the use schema method that had, as Martin explained, that had a separate list of schemas that was removed now in the 09 version of schema mount. So we now point directly to schemas in Yang library, so we don't have any separate list of schemas. So it's quite nicely integrated with the Yang library. And this setup also means that we can embed the schemas recursively. So any embedded schemas can contain, again, this same structure to define embedded schema of the second level and so on. Any questions to this schema? I would like to point out that it's really quite similar to an augment So this target node is what we had in as the parameter of an augment. This is the target node for embedding the schema. We can also have this. The use schema is the reference to one of the schemas that are defined in this schema list. The when condition is the same as in an augment, so it will have completely identical XPath context for evaluation and so on. And these two last things come from schema mount. Basically, it's the config flag that can specify whether the embedded schema will be completely read-only or not. And parent reference is again identical to what we have in schema mount. This helps to include some nodes from the parent instance tree to the embedded data tree. Yeah, Rob.
Rob Wilson, Cisco. So just to clarify, I think I know the answer to this, but just to maybe for the room, this means that you could embed a schema anywhere in the tree.
Yes,
no restrictions.
that's the idea.
Any schema anywhere.
I have my last slide will discuss this issue, so we can then come back to it.
Jason Stern. If I understand the model, you have a list of embedded schemas with the target as the key. Does that mean we could only embed one schema at a particular node? Like if you were trying to put something under, I'm just trying to think if you're trying to put multiple schemas under a container, embed multiple schemas.
Do you mean inside? Inside? So,
okay, but your target defines a node in the schema.
yeah, okay.
So what if you
Well, of course.
So the schema itself contains a list of modules, set of modules.
Right.
So you could define a schema that contains whichever set of modules you want, and then that's what's embedded.
Yeah, so we could actually have a number of module sets inside the same schema. So this can be, I don't know, maybe this could also, of course, be changed to allow explicitly multiple schemas at the same target, but I don't know if it's necessary. Martin?
Yeah, Martin Björklund. So to Jason's point, I mean, you wouldn't, with this proposal, you would not support what we have today with inline, and that the LNE use case requires, where you would have possibly different schemas at different instances of the same mount point.
No, this explicitly does not support this inline case. Yeah, so it's completely, because I suppose that schema mount will be able to support these requirements. I mean the inline schema, so this is not necessary.
So you see this as an addition to the existing schema mount, so this would be used for something else. So the schema mount that we have now.
Yes, it's quite possible to work on the existing schema mount to improve it somehow for the future. That's fine, but that's the inline. Basically, both of the methods that are now there are the former inline method. So I believe that will be one possibility that data model developers can use, and this will be another possibility. That's really much more like some kind of an external augment or an augment with an externally specified target node. So yes, so in this case we are just manipulating the schema. So in the same way as an augment, if we augment let's say a list node, then the schema for all list entries is still the same.
Right, just to clarify, so you're saying that this proposal will not, it will not be instead of what we have.
Right, so this is just some alternative method for creating the data model from Yang modules. Okay, so
can you go back one slide?
yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm being slow on Yang Library BIS. What's a schema node ID?
Well, that's a type that I just created for this purpose, but it's the schema node ID that we use for augment. So it's the same syntax as we use in the augment,
Okay.
in the augment parameter, right? So it will be some slash separated list of
That's fine.
of
It's same as an augment. I get it.
same
Thank you.
as in augment. And so the first example I have, I redid the LNE schema that we now have in the schema mount draft. So basically, the main difference is here in the boldface again. So instead of using some reference to a Yang extension like mount point, what we have in schema mount, it's explicitly written using some. So here is an example of such a schema node identifier. Again, we are using the prefixes that are defined in this namespace list, but this namespace list is not just for the purpose of this target specification, it's also used for parent references, so it's not anything really extra. So as you can see, the embedded schema is defined somehow, so this LNE modules is a module set that contains all that is necessary. And then we define the parent top-level schema. That's almost the same as before, but now we have this embedded schemas container that defines, that points to the LNE schema entry of the schema list, and also specifies where the new schema should be attached. Any questions, comments to this? Jason? No comment. And yesterday, during Balázs' presentation, I also briefly commented on the possibility of using such a mechanism for validating his instance data snippets using standard Yang tools. So this is just a simple mock-up how this could work. So Balázs could have in his draft this module that could contain something else, but what we need here is just the container instance data, which is the wrapper for the instance data, as you probably remember from yesterday. And the container will be empty in this case, because this is the place where we want to embed other schemas. And then the schema part of Yang library BIS would be like this. So the parent module in this case will be that previous trivial module that contains only the instance data container. And then we define, sorry, this is the schema that we want to embed, so it can contain any module sets, like as here indicated by any modules. And this here is the parent schema that at the top level it has this trivial just the container instance data, and then we embed the schema that's called arbitrary schema here, and the target for this embedding will be exactly that instance data container. So this way we can really achieve what Balázs showed yesterday in his examples. And then if our tools support Yang library BIS and this mechanism, we can easily validate the documents where the instance data container embeds some basic arbitrary data. So any questions to this?
Rob Wilton, just one comment. I think it's obvious, but just again to restate it. So here, not only would you be standardizing Yang modules now, we'd also have to be including or standardizing some instance data to suggest or recommend how they're used.
Sorry.
So in like the LNE draft, you'd have to be standardizing not just the Yang module itself.
Yes.
The .yang file.
So this will be the augment of Yang library basically in this module.
So you would include in the RFCs these examples of how you imagine stuff to be mounted.
Yes. Yes. So we could include examples in, I mean, instance data examples using Balazs's convention. Otherwise.
Rob, how does that differ from what is in the LNE and NI documents? Rob?
So in the LNE and NI drafts today, you have a mount point that says this is where we're going to mount this information. Whereas in this solution, you don't have that mount point, that disappears. And instead, you have a Yang library file that describes what a server that was doing this equivalent thing would also have. So you'd have to put that in the draft as an example or probably as an example text.
Yeah. I actually was going to bring up a comment that was made in one of the interims, which is directly related to that. Is in this case, you still would be you would have a node that becomes a mount point. So you'd have, let's say, a container that becomes a mountain point. So it's not that the base model that's getting augmented with a mount still has have a node, correct? Or are you going to actually create the node?
I would like to prefer not to call it mount point or anything, or even use the term mount, because I think it's a bit misleading, but.
Well, that's why I said.
Yeah, but that's just.
It's
terminology.
this special,
But yeah,
special
so
augment.
that is-
schema augment.
So basically, maybe I have it on the next slide, so maybe we can discuss it there. I don't
Well, I
know.
was going to just make the comment that was made in the interim, where there's concern about, I think what that would allow is mixing of, that node that you're augmenting could have other children. And so you could be mixing schemas together, the base one plus the one that's being augmented. And there was some concern that might not, that could lead to A, confusion, and 2, added complexity. And I believe the response to that is, well, that could be the designer's choice on how to do that. And and I think the counter to that was, in order to, rather than have a convention, it would best be better to put in a restriction. And that's why we ended up where we were today. But I'm not saying we have to end up at the same point, but it's good just to remember the comments that were made.
Yes, this is true.
So Lou, so which designer are you talking about there? Is it the designer of the person that's writing the modules to the augmenting, or the mount being mounted onto
The
it?
base model.
Parent module.
But with this, you're allowed to put stuff anywhere.
Well, that was the concern. The concern is that might end up getting rather messy.
Yep.
And both from the implementer standpoint and the client standpoint, having basically this overlaid, it almost becomes like a union mount.
Yes. But you could probably.
My responses to this are on the next slide, so.
Okay, great.
I
Thank you.
don't know, Balazs, did you have any comment to this example still?
Yes, yes. To Rob, it is the intention, if and when needed, then instance data can be part of a formal description of what we want. So I see no problem with instance data being a prescriptive part of any RFC, if
Yeah.
it is needed.
Okay, and now we have this issue of schema node identifiers versus Yang extension that's used in schema mount. So that's the difference. The first sentence just summarizes the difference. Here we use schema node identifiers, whereas schema mount uses the mount point extension. And indeed, there was such concern that this schema node identifiers just allow for having the root of the embedded schema anywhere, whereas the schema mount or mount point extension basically shows all the places where this can happen. However, I have 3 replies to this. First of all, augments, as we know them and love them, also use schema node identifiers. We could possibly design augments in the same way to use some extension or whatever to indicate the locations that can be augmented. We didn't do that, and in my view, it doesn't seem necessary to formally indicate all places in the augmented module that may receive some external data as some kind of augment points. So I believe it's not necessary here either, and the situation is pretty much the same. And then regarding that extension or some other tag that would just label some nodes as candidates for some embedded schemas, I believe that in fact the presence of such an extension or tag doesn't guarantee that something really appears at that place, which is probably what was the idea of the design time schema mount originally. That's still described in the schema mount draft. But we are not doing this here. This really requires changes to Yang itself. So what we are doing here is really some augment that with the target node specified externally. And in this case, even if we had some extension indicating the candidates for schema embedding, it doesn't mean that something really ends up there, because it's up to the implementer that composes the Yang library data whether this mount point or whatever is used or not. So it doesn't guarantee that something appears there, and on the other hand, it also doesn't guarantee that some external stuff does not end up in other places that are not tagged with this extension or whatever, because we have the good old augments, and the implementer again can use augments to put stuff anywhere. So I don't see a really compelling reason to not to permit it here. I believe that implementers usually want to do something that will work for the devices, and it means they will not be doing silly things like putting some stuff in arbitrary places. But in fact, if the implementer is crazy, he or she can do it easily with schema, with mount point extensions as well. So I believe there is no real danger that this can be somehow add more complexity. And as I said, a good point of this is that most of the concepts are already present in augments, and they are reasonably good understood. And for tool makers, this will, I would argue, this will mean even less complexity, because most of the functions like parsing the schema node identifiers and locating the target nodes should be already present in their code. Martin?
Yeah, Martin Böcklund. Just a comment about the comparison with augment. Augment is different because when you augment something, you build up to the schema that you augment. Whereas in this case, where you have mounted schema, they work in some kind of a jail situation where you can't do references to the rest of the schema as well. So you can't just implement this the same way you do with augment. It needs something else. It's just a comment, but it is different than...
Yes, of course, that's true. That's true, because it's the module author who writes an augment already by specifying the target node. The author already knows where it will be placed, so it can just write XPath expression that just extend this target node path, and so on. That's right. So my point here is that from the point of view of the recipient module, it really doesn't matter, because we don't have any indication of possible places for augmenting in the recipient modules. So we don't have it here either. For sure, there are differences, like as you said, because here we have to have a complete schema. We can have RPCs in the modules that are being embedded. So we will have to take some care and maybe apply the principles that we already had in schema mount. So it's different, but some of the concepts are really similar to an augment.
But I actually don't agree. I think this only means that augmenting or embedding a schema is just as a serious decision as defining an augment or defining any container. Even if it's done in runtime, the consequences are the same. You should take just as much care.
Right. So any more comments? If not, then I'm done.
You know, it's Lou. I have one comment, not so much on the content of the proposal, but on the, one of the comments you made along the way is it not supporting design time mounts? And one of the questions I have for you and for the working group, and certainly for Martin, is whether or not we want to consider design time mounts as part of this discussion.
Yeah, but as I said, in any case, this really requires a new version of Yang, and we have to consider. I think this is not part of the existing Yang architecture, and it may interfere in various ways in other mechanisms like augments and so on. So, if there is demand for this, we can look at that. But this really requires to have a new, probably Yang 2.0 or something, and this will be much more difficult, I believe, than the schema.
Okay.
Even though schema mount wasn't that easy, as it turned out, but I think this is really a massive change to Yang, in fact.
Well, I very much hope that by defining instance data and defining instance data for a Yang library, that will cover part of, or maybe the full of design timeouts. You only have to say that this content of the Yang library, this description of what is mounted where, is mandatory for my node or whatever standard node.
Exactly. That's the idea, that this instance Yang library data become part of the data models, official part of the data model specification. And here, I believe that perhaps it would also make sense to declare it to be some kind of metadata rather than just normal state data as it is now.
So just to be clear, Balaji, you would support us thinking, including design time mounts in a solution as part of this discussion? So he's nodding his head yes for the remote participants.
Yes, I actually have some implementations in Ericsson that needs that. So yes, I think that's, actually I would be happy if schema mount, either version, could reference instance data and state that by defining instance data, you actually implement design time mounts.
I believe this is really something different. What Lou has in mind, probably, I don't know.
Well, I'm not going to come forward with any proposals in this area, so I look forward to seeing what Balaji.
So I think the idea of this design time is that the author of the parent module explicitly writes the modules or the data model, whatever that's supposed to appear in some specific locations. So
yes, I believe that can be fulfilled with instance data. If it's the author of the parent module or some higher level authority that coordinates the parent and child modules, that's a different issue. But yeah, it's a tool to define the bounds.
So if I understand it correctly, you mean that these Yang library instance data would be just part of a Yang module or something?
No,
like
part of a RFC or part of some document.
Yeah, but that's already possible here, I believe.
And that's why I would very much like if people agree that include at least a statement about this possibility in the Yang mount.
So Roberto, just a point to realize on this, doesn't that mean that like an LNE draft would require, the approach to the LNE draft, that it would require the instance data to list the specific Yang modules that are going to then be augmented or be mounted into that point?
Yeah, but I believe, well, LNE can use either that inline or this former use schema At least in the previous version, this possibility was there. And if we had this use schema approach, then some state data, some instance data are necessary anyway to specify the module.
I'm just confused. I meant network instances rather than LNAs.
Lou as contributor, I authored those documents. I don't think either it would be appropriate in either of those documents, actually. Although I guess we could say that design time, it includes Yang library because that's a requirement of schema mount. So that's one form of design time. I wouldn't want to see any others in that document. But there's been other documents that have come up in other working groups that people have said, well, maybe we should use schema mount here. And for example, if you have a service module and you want to be able to get down to describing the details of the network element in that service module, it might make more sense to allow for a mount at that point. And if you were going to mount there, you might say, here are the ones you have to mount, and here's the ones you may, and then others may be implementation specific. So,
Okay, so I worry that gives you a tight coupling between drafts and modules that you don't necessarily want.
I didn't follow the response.
So it concerns me that your parent module is then going to have a tight reference to specific revisions of those child modules. A whole lot effectively get locked together, I think, if you have that level of detail in there.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect it. Again, I'm not writing any drafts right now that use this, but I could see it just, why would it be version specific there?
Because that's what the instance data would naturally give you, I think.
I think that the NI data model can be done in a very similar way as the LNE module, basically just by specifying appropriate modules that are useful for the NI case. So it should be similar to this, basically.
So Martin Berglund, I mean, you also have, in the schema, you have things like deviations and features, and you probably don't want to add those to the instance document in the RCs. And then you would have to say that the instance document that you include is not really what the device would have. It would have something similar or something like that. Anyway, my real comment was actually about what you said earlier. You said, or a clarification question, you said this would require a new version of Yang. What
No, I mean not this, but some kind of design time schema mount or whatever, which was we had in the schema mount. We have these three phases. So this is about the first that we claim we do not support in schema mount. This approach doesn't support it either. Directly, so that it's not possible to write in the parent module what exactly should become where, what should be embedded, what modules should be pulled in. So, but this approach does not require any changes to Yang.
Okay, fine. No. So another comment on that is that I think it's hard to say that something that we don't know what it is would require a new version of Yang. I mean, we don't have any proposal for design time. I can imagine.
Yeah, but this is what Lou opened. So Lou wanted us to somehow subscribe to the idea of working on this design time approach as well. So
yeah, so I don't mind if someone wants to have a proposal for something like that.
Sure.
And then we can evaluate and see what it is. So right now I don't really know what it would look like.
The comment it's Lou, the comment I was making is you said it was implied that it might be out of scope. And I'm just asking the question is, does the working group want it in scope or out of scope? And I think Martin's suggestion of, if someone wants to come up with a proposal and then we'll evaluate it in context makes perfect sense.
yeah.
But I still believe that actually with instance data design time is solved. What I have heard here as arguments, but do we really want to prescribe this or that? Yes, that's a decision. Probably not the decision of the parent module, but the decision of the, routing work group or separate RFC. The instance data gives you the tools to prescribe a lot, a bit, nothing, but it gives you the tool.
Yes, basically it means that if you write a module, the parent module, at the same time as these instance data, then you can specify anything you want. So this design time is more that you write some kind of module and yeah.
So, Rob Wilton, I think rather than the instance data itself, you probably want to just write some text to suggest what you'd find in there. So that's, I think, the difference is rather than it being specifically, you will see this information when you do,
Yes.
when you create a Yang library, you'd expect to find these sorts of things there, which would just be a textual description.
Right, I think it would be useful really to come up with examples when the design time is something that's really not covered by these approaches, so that we need to see some use cases for this design time that warrant some work on this. Okay, any more comments? If not, then
Yeah, your timing is perfect. We just said we probably have 5 more minutes, and then we got to move to Martin. So that's great. Thank you.
Okay, so I have just one slide that's going to describe what we have what we had in the pre-09 document that was sent out to the list. It's very similar to what Lara just described, with the maybe major difference is that we still use the mount point extension statement. So it's not open-ended. You can only do this where you have the mount points defined. But otherwise, you can always only do this where you have the mount points defined. The other difference is that this proposal still supports the inline case as it is. So what we have here is that we have the same tree as we have in the current schema mount document, but then we also have this uSchema case that has a reference up to the new Yang library. So this proposal would require the new version of the Yang library, where we can define the schemas in a recursive manner. So again, it's very similar. The main difference between this one and what Lada just presented is the existence of the mount point extension, I would say, and that this is an extension of the current schema mount solution. So we don't have 2 different ways of doing things. And essentially what this solves is that it gives you a way to have, when you know that the schema is the same for all instances of the mount point, you can declare it here and not use the inline case, but instead have reference up to the schema that you have in the normal Yang library. So in a way, it's an optimization.
So if I understand it correctly, you intend it as a replacement for the current schema mount.
Yeah,
stuff
or rather an
that we have.
update to the current one.
I must say I would rather prefer to keep these, and this was my position from the beginning, as you know, to keep this in line and use schema or whatever approach separate, not to combine it, because I believe these are really two different approaches. In the inline case, you need some instance data to find the embedded Yang library in, and so the only use case I can think of is that there is some mount point that can be used alternatively for the inline or use schema approach. But yeah, we can even combine that in this approach and in my approach, because I can use the same mount point as the target for the embedded schema, so that's possible as well. So I would really prefer, if we do this, maybe just to get rid of the choice and use only the use schema case here, this would make the Yang library simpler, and I believe the inline case can be covered separately.
Oh, yeah, so I'm a bit worried that we're making the entire thing very complex and complicated by having similar ways of doing kind of the same thing.
Yeah, but
And this whole schema combination thing is quite complicated. And so what should people use? Why do we have many ways of doing almost the same thing?
what I could see from the previous development of schema mount is that people really were quite often confused. They didn't know what is schema nodes, what is data nodes, and I believe by mixing this inline, which means some instance data manipulation and schema only manipulation, this really adds to this confusion. I believe if we have two different concepts, it's better to have them separate, some separation of concerns. So if we find out that something is wrong with one approach, we needn't change the whole thing and influence people that may be only interested in the other approach. So I don't see any problem.
Right, so my suggestion is not to have two different concepts. We would have mount point, and then this is just this schema mount structure just shows you where you would find the schema. Either you find it under the mount point or by reference to the normal place where you have the schema.
Yeah, but I really believe they are two different concepts in fact. So
Yeah,
they are similar, that's right, but they are very...
I agree that your proposal with embedded schema, that is something completely different from the schema mount that we have. So in that sense, you're right, they are really different things.
It's different only in the sense that I'm using that schema node identifier, and the solution uses still some Yang extension. So we can also do it to define another extension for this embedded schema approach, and so that these two cases would also be separate, and then we can do it basically without the inline, so that it only won't be combined under one Yang extension, which I believe would be a good thing. But as I try to explain, I don't think that the extension is necessary.
So Tim Karinoki, I did have a question, and I wanted to try.
Do you mind leaning into the mic a little bit? It's just hard to hear you.
Shorter guys. So if I understand correctly, did you say that this solution would only be able to be used with the NMDA version of Yang libraries only, not the pre?
It would be used with the new version of Yang library, not necessarily with NMDA. So the new version of Yang library.
Keep in mind, there's two parts to the discussion now. We have a document that's going through last call. In fact, Joel has already started last call on it. This isn't changing any of that. That will work for existing Yang library, new Yang library. This is what's the right long-term solution.
Absolutely.
And certainly,
But even this solution would work fine with the server that does not implement NMDA. But
Right.
it does require the new Yang library, because there is where we have the schema, the new schema definition, right? Where you can have multiple
So
schemas.
you go to the new Yang library, but you can use it with pre-NMDA solutions,
Right.
right?
Yes.
All right, that's the only thing I wanted to make sure that we're still kind of, because it's going to be a while before that stuff tails out.
Okay. Any other comments? Rob?
So I've got a comment between the two solutions, but I don't know if now's the right time to ask it or whether.
yeah, if there's no more specific comments, we can bring Lada up also and see where it goes. I'm not sure if we're going to have any more additional discussion or if we had it already, but so from a presentation standpoint, Martin is done, and now we're moved on to the open discussion. So Lada, if you want to come up, you can. If you want to stay there, that's fine.
So my comment is, what I see different between the two solutions is really the question of how heavyweight is a mount point. So if a mount point's a heavyweight construct and you don't want to have too many mount points, you want to sort of limit its usage, then I prefer a solution where you have an explicit mount point in the schema. So you mark the places, the unusual places where you have these mount points. Whereas if you want mount points to be lighter weight and be used a lot more, then I think maybe the solution that Lara's suggesting seems that it sort of suggests that path that you say that the mounts are not a heavyweight thing. You expect them to be used more frequently, more like augments, not as frequently as augments. And then having that flexibility maybe seems easier. So my personal view is I think a mount point is a heavier weight mechanism. I think that often you would end up writing additional code potentially to support those places where you see the mount points. I don't know if that's definitely true, but that's what I would imagine for LNEs and NIs. You've got some code there that's handling that, and hence I see a mount point extension as being a good thing. I think it's good to mark that. One other comment that I think that you could do here is, I mentioned this to you previously, is you can have additional extensions under the mount point that limited whether you could see the information either in line or via a schema potentially. So in the NI case, you might say, actually, I want the schema to be available up front. I don't expect it to be available dynamically. So that's one other benefit, I think, of this solution could be.
Any more comments on schema mount? All right, so if not, then we do have another 24 minutes in the session, and we can, there was two items that we didn't get to yesterday, and we could ask for those presentations now. So maybe we'll start with Alex Clem and that presentation. It was the second to last, I think.
Not this one.
No. Discrepancy detection.
Well, Angelo, if I may say one word about the schema mount. I'm a bit afraid because we see three solutions for schema mount, which was already described as complicated. I'm scared.
Oh, think of it this way. We're at the start of a discussion and we're at a brainstorming level. And when we're brainstorming, it's always good to get out as many ideas as possible. And then as proposals are made and documented, we'll cull down and see where the working group takes us. But this was the start of a discussion. So from my standpoint, the more ideas, the better at this point.
For the beginning of the discussion, yeah, I agree. For the end of the discussion.
But we're just starting it now.
Yeah, first of all, that's why I wanted really to avoid the term schema mount, so that it's some new mechanisms. So we are also not complaining that we are adding some new mechanisms, a part that may be competing with augments. So, and in fact, we had all these mechanisms already in schema mount 08. So we are just trying to somehow restructure the whole thing and provide it in a way that's easy to understand for the users. Whether we succeed or not, that will be seen. But
think of this as the experiment that Benoit was talking about yesterday about being able to publish a module and then immediately start thinking about the next revision of it. And this will be the existence proof of that, of see how that works. I see some people not liking that analogy, but
sorry, that was about models, not about Yang language constructs.
Well, part of what we're trying to work through as a working group is figuring out how we can do things more quickly, and this will be one case of that, or maybe the first case of that.
Right. So to cue up Alex's presentation, it was presented yesterday in the NetConf working group. And at the end of that presentation, we polled the working group to see if who's interested in the work. There was I think a decent amount of interest. And then would it make sense for it to be in the NetConf working group? I don't believe there was any hands that were raised. And then would it make sense for it to be in the Netmod working group? And there's, I think, half of the room raised their hands. So Alex is presenting it here now because it's the more appropriate working group for the work. And, but it is the first time it's being presented here, so we understand probably a few have had a chance to look at the draft.
Well, and so probably quite a few people will have already seen it, also will have seen this presentation. So I guess one of the next steps, if we do decide to transfer this, will be to resubmit this under Netmod, I suppose. And given that basically the reason to transfer this to Netmod is that the core of this is really actually a Yang data model that defines an RPC, and as such, basically it's perhaps not a protocol option, therefore better here. So this is that was basically the thinking of that. But so what that is about is basically it's about comparison of the NMDA data stores. I just have, basically what this draft defines is an RPC that allows to compare NMDA data stores. The reason is that as information can propagate between data stores, there's a chance for differences and so forth to exist. Which can lead to potentially to various situations that basically require troubleshooting and so forth. So how would you basically detect that you have such conditions, and basically having this having such an operation or such an RPC helps with that to detect issues, anything from unexpected failures to longer than expected time lag of change propagation to different origins of information for the operational data store, those sorts of issues. This was in revision 03 in NetConf. The changes since Singapore, where it was first presented, is basically that the draft now contains a set of examples. It talks about comparison. Earlier, it used the formulation discrepancy detection, so people didn't like that. That was one thing that we removed. One feature in this draft is a dampening feature that allows you to essentially, when you do this comparison, wait for a certain amount of time to see basically if a comparison is only fleeting or whether it persists for a longer period of time. There was a conditional feature before, but based on the discussion that we had on the NetConf list, that is something that was felt to have that should be removed, or basically that is basically moved to possible future extensions. And the Younger data model has been updated accordingly. And likewise, there were also suggestions made on the working group to have also the possibility of an additional pre-filtering step to exclude data from the comparison that would not be within the scope of both data stores. So for instance, if you have operational data and you're comparing or config false data, you're comparing a configuration data store, you should basically exclude that from the comparison. So basically, the next steps there were basically one thing. Dampening has been removed. There was basically to get the sense that this is the right decision. Essentially, I personally happen to think it's an interesting feature, but sure, we will simplify this. Second aspect concerns that the origin discrepancy should be also added. So basically, that within the differences, one should basically say also basically the origin of the data. That is something that needs to be added. And then the remaining question was basically to ask for working group adoption, which is which now pertains to Netmod, not to NetConf. That's basically all that I had. This basically is just the tree of this data model. It's fairly straightforward. Comments?
Can you leave the last slide on?
Sure.
So Rob Wilson, so it's a question actually. In terms of the comparison, if you're comparing what's in intended versus what's in operational, I think you may be restricted in terms of how you can make that comparison. I think you can probably ask a system to say, is everything that's in intended, does that match what's that subset, config true, false, config true nodes, are those all in operational potentially? I don't think you necessarily want to be able to do a full diff, and there may be further constraints as to actually what you really want to ask the system. So it could be that there's configuration values have been overwritten in some way through system configuration. So I think I haven't read the latest version of the draft, but there may be some nuances in terms of exactly what that comparison is and what it makes sense to do that needs to be described and documented if it's not already.
Right, so that was basically this point that we basically now put into this possibilities for future extension was basically precisely this point, basically what is points in the, no, sorry, actually, the last item down here at the bottom of the, I don't know if I can point, at the bottom of this list was basically this pre-filtering step that I think this is what you're referring to, right? Use this, no, this is not a question,
It's not so
sorry.
much filtering the data, I think it's actually, maybe another way is what's the actual problem being solved and how does this solve that problem? I think is maybe where I'm getting
Yeah.
at.
So clearly, basically, the intent, well, basically, the usefulness is for data that propagates from one to the other. So in that sense, yes, you want clearly to compare data that is only that is contained in both data stores, not
So
in one versus the other.
Sorry?
So Martin Löklund, I was also going to suggest that you actually, maybe that's your intention, move this from a future enhancement and actually put it into the draft, this thing with just comparing the nodes that are actually in the schema in both data stores. I think that's something that you put into the draft.
Okay.
And I also would like to see what the thing that Rob mentioned, whereas I think it's more like a set subtraction, right? So you want to see what's intended. You want to ensure that everything is intended is actually also in operational.
Yes.
But if something in operational was not intended, it doesn't really matter, even if it's has the same schema node, right? So even if it's in the same, if it's in both the schema for intended and in operational, you still don't want to see it in this operation if it came from somewhere else, if it's not in intended.
Although
It's
that's
just to
although-
ensure that intended has been successfully applied.
Although in that particular case, so actually, I'm not sure I fully actually understand it, so let me basically ask you back. Basically, if you have something that, if you're comparing intended and operational, and you're expecting, for instance, that the operational, the origin of this indicates that it came from intended, because it isn't intended. However, the origin says it is from system, but instead of intended. That is something that would seem interesting in the condition that you would want to know about,
Yes.
and therefore not exclude.
Exactly, but I think you already had that. You mentioned that
Right.
already, right? So that's a discrepancy that, or diff that you want to detect,
Mhm.
certainly.
Right.
My other point was when I read the document, I think you need to explain how the filters are supposed to work. How the filters are supposed to work. What is the service supposed to do with it? I assume that the idea is that you evaluate the filter on one data store, then on the other, and then you do the diff thing.
Is that you basically apply the same selection, if you will, on both data stores?
Right, so you need to explain how that works, especially if you also do this thing with, pruning nodes that are not in the schema.
Sure, yes, we'll do that.
And, by the way, I think this is important work, and I think it should be done here.
Thanks.
So just as they were talking, I was thinking another example would be, for example, they had a list of interfaces where some of them are explicitly configured and some were created by the system, then you don't necessarily want that to flag up as being a problem, the fact you've got a loopback 0 interface created, or if you had IP addresses that have been learned through DHCP as well as statically configured ones, you may not be asking, show me all those differences, or when you really want to ask is, has all my configuration been successfully applied, is what you're trying to maybe get at. So having some discussion of those points and consideration that would be potentially useful. But again, I think this is generally useful.
So I guess basically the ask is also to put instead of putting this for future possibilities, we include this as a feature in the draft. All right. Makes sense.
The pre-filtering and maybe more.
Okay, thanks.
I also support this work. I think it's really useful. And regarding the filters, I would suggest maybe to start with something simpler rather than inventing some complicated filtering mechanism. Perhaps it would be sufficient just to be able to specify the root of the trees that are to be compared and maybe depth of the trees, just something really simple, and then the client can somehow combine the needs and get the information that's necessary.
Right. Yeah, we absolutely do want to keep it simple. We don't want to invent new constructs, but we use.
So Martin Buckler, I don't think they did though. They have sub-tree filter and expat filter, which is the standard filters that we're using, right?
Yes, that's what this is.
On the other hand, I mean, you have a choice of the filters, right? So you can probably have an additional case that is just an instance identifier, which would be the root, which would be an even simpler filter.
Okay.
And then the other ones could be defined with features. That's an option.
Right, sorry. But sub-tree filters are used in netconf and use XML. So if somebody wants to use it in RESTconf and in JSON, this would create maybe some complications. I don't know. As I see it, the important use cases, it seems to me that just some really simpler solutions could be enough so that I can repeat this compare method several times to get the information I need somehow.
Just on Martin Björklund, and an additional comment on that, we have sub-tree filtering and expat filtering also, the notification drafts that are supposed to be protocol agnostic.
Okay, can we cut the mic there so there's time for the next presentation? Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
And Igor?
So just to be clear, you're going to republish that under Netmod, and we'll discuss here and possibly make updates based on the comments you've received.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
And you want to save time for discussion?
Yes.
Hi. So basically, to make it really fast, I'd like to provide the keys of the idea that was effort of our design team for push enhancements. Basically, netconf proved to be very useful when in the interactive kind of paradigm of network control, when the client asks for certain reconfigurations, then pulls some data states, analyze it, call some RPCs, make some analysis, ask for more reconfiguration, and so forth. So there are many important use cases where actually always get data, edit config, call RPC kind of request needs to be batched together, pushed to the server, ask the server to trigger them on a particular specified by the client event, and order them based on the conditions which involve like a current or historical data states. And the whole point of this model that we developed is to enable configuration of such ECAs, event condition actions, and put them to the server. Okay, so ECA basically they have four components. Policy variable, it's a memory. It's containers where you keep intermediate results while you evaluate conditions and actions, and which could be used for immediate or future condition evaluation. For example, if you want to condition certain actions based on, say, median value of particular data state, policy variable the place where to keep it and to keep updated all the time. And policy variables could be, just like C variables, could be global, shareable between multiple ECAs, or local, specific only to a particular ECA. And local variables could be both dynamic and static, basically dynamic come and go with each execution, and static survive. Basically, they persistent through the executions. So, when it's necessary, what kind of use cases you want to consider? Basically, we consider what we call closed-loop network automation. Say there are events where it is very clear what to do in case this event happened, and it's just possible for the client to say, whenever you see something like, say, failure, please, check this data states and do these actions. Right. Then there also it is basically sometimes there is no time for client network negotiation. So in order to improve like a responsiveness of the network, so you do you do better if you start acting as fast as possible. And it also improves scalability of the client, because as soon as the client may delegate certain decisions to the network, it can take care of much more things. And finally, there is use cases when it just free programmable logic can be pushed from the client to the server to do what-ifs kind of things. Like, for example, it could be an ECA push and instructing the server to say that in case there is a single or double failures on the network, please tell me which services will be affected, and if they're affected, how they could be recovered, what new path it will take, and report those that will be down after that. So the event, basically, it could be either explicitly defined event, or it could be a YARN push or smart filter trigger. So we say that the events mostly, we believe, they will be defined by the client. The condition is a logical expression condition could be the logical expression, which it could be either expressed as a single XPath expression, or it could be
audio? The mic just dropped. AV? Hello? Here.
Yeah. It could be a simple XPath expression, or it could be built from simple comparisons that could be compounded hierarchically.
Igor, like 3 minutes.
Yes, and the actions, basically, that's the important part. We only limit our actions to whatever is already possible to do interactively, which is normal netconf RPCs, and also RPCs defined by the model, by model supported by the server, but nothing beyond that. So there's no danger to basically to put some damage beyond what could be done interactively. And when ECA is executed, there is also provision of the cleanup condition action list, which would basically do all the necessary rollback in case one of the actions in the normal list was tried and rejected by the server. That's it. So that's all I have to say.
That's it. Okay. Any comments? Maybe from Nicholas? Nicola. Sorry. No.
So this was presented in NetConf. It seemed that this was just a model-based thing, so it applied better to this group. From a process standpoint, I'll ask Kent as the NetConf chair what he thinks, and do you prefer to see it talked about in here, in NetConf? And then we can ask if this group is interested.
Well, I continue to think that there may be a partial overlap with the FSM work that Nicola's been working on.
So, and since that works here, that would make sense.
At least for now, I think we should continue to have that discussion. How large of an overlap is there? What's the opportunity for, bringing these two ideas together? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but I think the jury's still out, for me at least. Do you want to know?
So basically, first of all, we do not believe that there's a lot of overlap, but even considering that we have some overlap, like for example, we can define the same way what event means, right? So in either case, we can produce, for example, common groupings that we can share, but it would be very desirable to continue work on the models, at least for now, separately. And then if it really proves to be that it's a big overlap, we will combine. But we want to avoid this, ugly children that sometimes produce when, incompatible decisions that are going to try to marry together.
And this is fine. I mean, they're currently both individual drafts, and they'll continue to be progressing. And as we gain further understanding, we'll see what the opportunities are. Okay.
So we'll look for the continuing discussion in this working group.
And there was a poll for, in the NetConf working group, show of hands for, who thought this was interesting work. I guess we should do the same thing here. So if you think this is.
But to be fair, people haven't had a chance to read the document, so.
Okay, with the caveat that you only had this one presentation, but again, the idea of the closed loop automation. So just based on what you've heard in this presentation, show of hands for who thinks this is interesting work. Okay, a few? Call it a few or a good number?
How about a reasonable number?
A reasonable number. All right, thank you.
Hopefully it will improve.
Frankly, it's more than I expected. So,
And we're right on time?
I think so.
This is a wrap.
So thank you very much for two very good sessions.
Thank you, everybody.
And most importantly, let's note that we have an AD who has been incredibly supportive and helpful, and that he is finishing that role. And we have a new AD sitting farther in the back, who we look forward to continuing with that trend. So thank you both. And Benoit, we hope you will continue to show and contribute to this group, and that it's just a change of hats, not the departure. With that,
We're adjourned.